When the Speaker of the House has to tell the Prime Minister to stop whining about what questions the opposition is asking, you know PMQs has reached peak pettiness. Keir Starmer just got absolutely shut down by Lindsay Hoyle during Prime Minister's questions after he made a snarky jibe at Kemi Badenoch about her choice of questions. Badenoch was asking about NATO and Ukraine, specifically whether Starmer would call for an urgent meeting of NATO leaders given the chaos with Trump, Venezuela, and threats to Greenland. Reasonable question, important topic. Except Starmer decided instead of answering, he'd complain that Badenoch has 6 questions, and she's not even asking her second question about what we did yesterday, like a child complaining that someone isn't paying enough attention to their show and tell presentation. And Hoyle, the speaker, had to step in and remind the Prime Minister that he doesn't get to dictate what the opposition asks. You don't need to worry about the responsibility of the questions of the opposition. That's a polite parliamentary way of saying shut up and answer the question. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where we watch the Prime Minister get spanked by the Speaker for being too fragile to handle basic parliamentary scrutiny. Let's break down this embarrassing moment and what it reveals about Starmer's mental state. So here's the scene. It's Prime Minister's Questions, the weekly ritual where the Prime Minister faces questioning from MPs. The leader of the opposition gets 6 questions. That's the format. Kemi Badenoch, as Conservative leader, gets to ask Starmer 6 things, and she's chosen to focus on foreign policy, specifically the absolute chaos surrounding Donald Trump's actions in Venezuela, his threats against Greenland, and the implications for NATO and Western security. These are legitimate, important questions. Britain is a founding member of NATO. NATO is potentially under threat if Trump continues down his current path. The leader of the opposition asking whether the Prime Minister will call an urgent meeting of NATO leaders is exactly the kind of question she should be asking. But Starmer doesn't want to answer that question. Why? Probably because any answer makes him look bad. If he says, yes, I'll call for an urgent NATO meeting, he's admitting the situation is critical and he hasn't done enough yet. If he says, no, I won't call for a meeting, he looks complacent and weak. So instead of answering, he deflects. He tries to change the subject. He complains that Badenoch says she wants to hear about Ukraine. She's got 6 questions. She's not even asking her second question about what we did yesterday. She's got the opportunity. Let's break that down, because it's pathetic on multiple levels. First, he's complaining that Badenoch isn't asking the questions he wants her to ask. That's not how this works. PMQs exist to hold the government to account. The opposition asks whatever questions they think are important or whatever questions they think will embarrass the government. The Prime Minister doesn't get to pre-approve the questions. He doesn't get to say, I'd rather you asked about this other thing. That would completely defeat the purpose of parliamentary accountability. The whole point is that the PM has to defend his record and his decisions on whatever topic the opposition chooses. If Starmer could dictate the questions, he'd just ask himself softballs about how amazing he is. Second, he's specifically complaining that she's not asking about what we did yesterday. So Starmer's government did something yesterday, presumably related to Ukraine, and he wants credit for it. He wants Badenoch to ask about it so he can brag about it. And because she's not asking about it, he's throwing a tantrum. This is like a kid who drew a picture and is angry that nobody's asking about it, so he has to bring it up himself. It's needy, it's desperate for validation, and it's completely inappropriate for a prime minister. You don't get to demand that the opposition ask questions that let you boast. If you've done something good, you can talk about it in other forums. You can put out press releases, you can give interviews, but you don't get to complain during PMQs that you're not being asked the right questions. Third, he says she's got the opportunity, as if Badenoch is wasting her 6 questions by not asking what Starmer wants her to ask. But those are her questions. She gets to use them however she wants. If she thinks NATO and Trump are more important than whatever Starmer did yesterday, that's her judgment to make. And given that Trump has just invaded Venezuela and is threatening Greenland, that judgment seems pretty reasonable. These are massive international crises. Asking about them isn't wasting questions. It's doing the job of opposition. So Starmer tries to deflect by complaining about Badenoch's questions, and Speaker Lindsay Hoyle immediately shuts him down. You don't need to worry about the responsibility of the questions of the opposition. That's a speaker reminding the prime minister of basic parliamentary procedure. The opposition asks whatever they want. Your job is to answer. You don't get to critique their questions or demand different ones. Just answer the question you've been asked. The fact that Hoyle had to say this explicitly on the record in front of the entire House is humiliating for Starmer because it makes him look like he either doesn't understand how PMQs works, which would be incompetent, or he does understand, but he's trying to manipulate the format because he can't handle scrutiny, which is weak. This moment is significant because it reveals Starmer's fragility. A confident prime minister who's comfortable with their record doesn't complain about what questions they're being asked. They answer confidently and then pivot to talk about their achievements if they want to, if they think. But Starmer is so defensive, so desperate for validation, that he can't even let a question about NATO pass without complaining that Badenoch should be asking about something else instead. That's not strength, that's weakness. And the speaker called him out on it in front of everyone. It also reveals that Starmer is more interested in talking about what he's done than in addressing current crises. He wants to boast about yesterday's achievements rather than answer questions about today's problems. That's backwards. Leadership is about dealing with the present and the future, not dwelling on the past. Yes, you should tout your accomplishments, but not when there are urgent crises that need addressing. Badenoch is asking about NATO because the situation is urgent. Trump is causing chaos. Western security is under threat. That's the priority. Whatever Starmer did yesterday, unless it's directly addressing that crisis, is less important. And Starmer's inability to recognize that shows poor judgment. The specific question about calling an urgent meeting of NATO leaders is also important, because it's testing whether Starmer will actually lead on an international stage. NATO is in crisis. Trump is threatening allies, cozying up to Putin, creating instability. Europe needs to step up. Britain, as one of the major NATO powers and a permanent UN Security Council member, should be leading the effort to hold the alliance together. So Badenoch asking if Starmer will call an urgent meeting of NATO leaders is asking if he'll show leadership. And instead of answering yes or no or explaining his approach, Starmer complains about the question. That tells you he doesn't have a good answer. He hasn't called a meeting, he hasn't shown leadership, and he's embarrassed about it, so he tries to change the subject. This isn't the first time Starmer has struggled at PMQs. He was good at it when he was opposition leader. He was forensic, prepared, effective at making the government look bad. But as prime minister, he's been consistently weak. He gets flustered, he gives non-answers, he deflects, he struggles with follow-ups. Part of that is because being PM is harder than being opposition. When you're in opposition, you can just criticize. You don't have to defend anything. But as PM, you have to defend your record, your decisions, your policies. And Starmer's record is bad. His decisions are unpopular, and his policies aren't working. So he deflects and complains and looks weak. The dynamic between Starmer and Badenoch is also interesting. Badenoch is relatively new as conservative leader. She's still finding her feet, but she's shown herself to be willing to ask tough questions and not to be intimidated by the prime minister. And Starmer clearly doesn't like it. He's used to being able to dominate through preparation and lawyerly dissection of arguments. But Badenoch doesn't play that game. She asks blunt questions about policy and leadership. And Starmer doesn't have good answers, so he tries to undermine her by suggesting she's asking the wrong questions or wasting her opportunities. That's a tell. It shows he's rattled. The speaker intervention is also significant in terms of parliamentary norms. The speaker is supposed to be neutral. He's not there to defend the government or the opposition. He's there to ensure parliamentary rules are followed and that debate is conducted properly. For the speaker to publicly rebuke the prime minister means Starmer crossed the line. He was trying to manipulate the format of PMQs in a way that's not acceptable, and Hoyle called him on it. That's the speaker doing his job, but it's embarrassing for Starmer because it makes him look like he needs to be corrected like a schoolboy who doesn't know the rules. The broader context is that Starmer is under immense pressure. His approval ratings are terrible. His government is unpopular. He's facing potential leadership challenges. The May elections are going to be a disaster. And he's desperate for any good news, any positive headlines, any validation that he's doing a good job. So when he does something, anything that he thinks is positive, he's desperate to talk about it. He wants credit. He needs credit. And when the opposition doesn't give him the opportunity to boast by asking the question he wants, he gets frustrated and complains. That's the psychology behind this moment. It's not strategic, it's emotional. He's lashing out because he's not getting the validation he desperately craves. The reaction to this moment has been predictable. Conservatives and reform supporters are mocking Starmer for being whiny and weak. Labor supporters are either defending him by saying Badenoch's questions were distracting from important issues, or they're silent because they know it doesn't look good. And neutral observers are just noting that the Prime Minister got slapped down by the Speaker, which is never a good look regardless of the details. PMQs is theater. It's about perception. And Starmer's perception coming out of this exchange is that he's thin-skinned, defensive, and unable to handle scrutiny. That's not what you want as a prime minister. The comparison to previous prime ministers is instructive. Can you imagine Margaret Thatcher complaining that the opposition wasn't asking the questions she wanted? Can you imagine Tony Blair whining that he wasn't getting enough credit for something he did yesterday? Can you even imagine Boris Johnson, for all his faults, being petulant about the format of opposition questions? No, because they understood that PMQs is adversarial. The opposition is there to make you look bad. Your job is to handle it with confidence and authority. You don't complain about the questions, you answer confidently, and then pivot to talk about your achievements if you want to, if they think. But Starmer is doing the opposite, and it's making him look weak. This moment also highlights Starmer's inability to think on his feet. A skilled politician would have pivoted. Badenoch asks about NATO, you give a brief answer about NATO, and then say, and I'm glad you mentioned Ukraine because yesterday we announced X, which shows our continued commitment. You turn her question into an opportunity to talk about what you want to